Good morning, everyone. I'm Luli Castro, Swiftland's Executive Director, and it is my pleasure this morning to welcome you to our webinar, The ABCs of Collection Development, Basic Concepts and Overview. We have a wonderful learning opportunity ready for you this morning with Dr. Melissa Adler, who is back by popular demand. This is the first in a series of 3 webinars she's doing for us, and she keeps on attracting your participation. Dr. Adler is an assistant professor in the School of Library and Information Science at the University of Kentucky. She has 7 years of library and teaching experience, including numerous continuing education courses and librarianship. Please welcome Dr. Adler and enjoy her webinar this morning. Dr. Adler.
Thank you, Luli. Good morning, everyone. It looks like we have a nice group here. And as Luli mentioned, I did teach a couple of webinars, I guess about a year ago, and they were great. It was a great experience. So I'm happy to be talking to you today about collection development. Please let me know if you can't hear me or if anything's unclear. Feel free to type in questions in the chat box. I'll try to keep track of those. But if it ends up being a bit difficult to manage, we'll just save them till the end. There should be time at the end. But I am running on battery power, and I'm a little nervous that it's not going to. I'm at 65% right now. We've had a power outage, and so I'm a little nervous that this isn't going to last an hour, but hopefully. So if I lose you, that's why. So let's get started. We'll move right along. Here we go. So. First of all, I want to just say a word about audience and who this webinar is intended for. This is a very basic level introduction to collection development. So this is meant for librarians and volunteers and library staff of all ranks at all types of libraries. So it's necessarily going to be very general. I am going to create a list of resources that are more geared toward library types, so that you can, I'm going to be talking about things like reviews and things like that and types of materials. So I'll supply a list, which I'm actually going to send probably Monday because I haven't quite finished it. But that way you can sort of focus in on what your particular needs are. But I don't want to lose anyone by getting too specific about particular types of resources. And so, if you found yourself as being a sort of accidental collection manager, or you've been asked to help select materials, or you just want, to know the basics, you're in the right place. So I just want to, first of all, think about what it means to be sort of a collection development person, because I think we don't quite realize how complicated collection development can get until we find ourselves in the position of making difficult choices. And I know I found myself in that kind of position in each of the libraries that I worked in, where there wasn't a collection development policy in place, and we found ourselves having to sort of, or the development policy was outdated, and so we found ourselves making difficult choices that didn't actually seem like they should be so difficult, but they were, because we couldn't agree about what was of value to our library, and we couldn't decide what we needed to get rid of or what we needed to focus our budget on. So it ends up getting tricky. And so some of the questions that you are likely to encounter, and what we'll cover in the entire series. Some of them will come up today, and then some will be covered in later webinars, 2 and 3. But things like, how do you decide what to purchase and in what format? Because format, as you probably are aware, is a big issue. Do we go electronic with this book, or do we do the print version? Things like that. How do you determine what is considered to be of value in itself, but then also of value to your particular collection? Do you need multiple copies in formats? And how do you, of course, stretch the library's dollar? That's the big question. Something we'll address in the 3rd session will be, are you willing to give up some of the local decision-making processes to save money? So things like resource sharing, and are you willing to sort of hand the decision-making processes over to consortia or vendors or things like that? How do you decide what to read or discard? And then how do you deal with gifts? That's another one. So you might find yourself, you get a box full of books that are sort of useful, but you're not sure what to do with them. You don't really have the cataloging staff to deal with these things. What do you do? How do you decide if you're going to actually keep them or not? So these are some of the things that we encounter as collection development librarians. And of course, each of these decisions has to be made within sort of an ethical framework that includes fairness and confidentiality and fiscal responsibility and so on. So what we're going to focus on today is the basics of collection development, some definitions. We'll survey, sort of the landscape, the types of resources that are available and that you're going to encounter. We're going to do an overview of intellectual freedom issues with regard to selection, talk about some of the criteria for selection, and I'll introduce you to sort of a broad overview of selection tools like review sources and things like that. And again, after today, I will supply you with a list of resources, but much of what I'm talking about today is drawn from this textbook by Peggy Johnson. You can't quite see the name maybe, but this just came out this year. It's the most recent edition. And so some of what I'm talking about today is coming from this book. Some is coming from web resources. But if you do want a textbook, I do recommend this one. It's recently published, up to date, and quite thorough, a good introduction. Okay, so first, we're going to start at the very, very basics. So this seems like a no-brainer in certain ways, but I think we need to start with a baseline. So what is a library collection? And although this seems like a very obvious question, I think if we pull this definition out almost word by word, we realize that it is maybe not necessarily as obvious as it seems. So we're talking about the materials in all formats and genres that a library owns or to which it provides remote access through either purchase or lease, right? And so it's really it's worth thinking about each of these terms. So the consideration of format, so things that are available in all kinds of different versions, whether a book might be in audio format or in electronic format and so on, and all of the different genres which are ever expanding. I'm thinking of graphic novels and things like that. And then the question of ownership is interesting. So it's not just limited to what the library owns. When we talk about library collections, we're also talking about things that we provide access to, whether it's through purchase or lease. So most electronic resources are leased or licensed, right? So ebooks, that's one of the central controversies around ebooks, is that libraries don't actually own the content. They purchase licenses, allowing a certain number of users to borrow the books. But it's a different framework from the actual purchase of a printed book. And then you can even expand this definition to think about things that are freely available out there, open source or Google Books or something, that perhaps a collection person is going to co-locate on your library website and make it so that your users encounter these things that they are likely to desire or need, right? And so that is actually something that augments the collection, but would also be under the purview of a collection development librarian. So the obvious landscape, the resource landscape. So we know about the printed materials, books and images and magazines and so on, audio, videos and periodicals and so on. But I do think it's worth considering for a moment how much libraries are changing. And if you are like me and you tell people that aren't in the library world that you are working in a library, you've probably you've probably been faced with questions about the obsolescence of libraries and whether books are disappearing and what it means, what the internet is doing to libraries and so on. And then, Amazon just released some, and I haven't read up enough on it, but there's this plan that Amazon has to allow people to sort of have an annual subscription to unlimited content on their Kindle. And so there was an article, I think in Forbes, that said, do we even need libraries anymore? Right? But so if we think about what the library was like 5 or 10, 20 years ago, and consider the fact that these changes didn't just happen. Rather, libraries across the country have made informed and calculated decisions about the needs and demands of our communities and responded in ways that have resulted in a major change in what libraries do and how they see their mission. Because if you think about it, 100 years ago, it used to be the case that you couldn't even walk into a library and check out a book of fiction. You had to check out a nonfiction work in order to also be allowed to get a fiction piece. And so there was this idea that the librarians had to furnish the best reading for its citizenry to promote the social good. But now we don't do that. We think about what the users want. And so that's what drives our collection. And even if we take just this obvious sort of landscape here, if we break that down, it ends up getting more complicated as well. So audio is actually quite a broad topic or a broad concept. Because if you think about it, there's the obvious audio books that people listen to for pleasure, but there also may be needs among people with disabilities that require audio, or there may be people that need audio equipment or resources for research or something like that. And then you have to think about, oh, do we want CDs, or do we want something that people will want to download to their own devices? What is it that we are going to need to purchase for our users that's going to satisfy them most, and is it going to be something that is going to last? So all these kinds of questions end up coming up, even with categories that seem like they might be straightforward. Videos as well. So we're no longer limited to just the DVD. There's the Playaway View, which is a preloaded video player that can hold hours of video content. And these devices are circulated at some libraries. And then there's this Freegal, which we do have at Lexington Public Library, but I find that it's got a very limited collection. It's very limited in scope and what you can actually choose. But it's great because you can actually just watch movies with a web browser. So all kinds of things are happening in the way of formats and types of resources. And it's ever expanding. It's actually quite difficult to stay on top of what's all out there. And so, of course, expanding this to the electronic realm, we see exactly, how broad this becomes. So academic libraries, for instance, are collecting things like data sets, and that's considered part of their collection that faculty, particularly in social science departments, will use. And then, of course, images and digital librarianship is a huge field. And then our electronic journals and aggregated databases. Faculty publications are being collected in institutional repositories. But again, this is it's a collection question. Software, open source materials, video games, and then the devices that we need to use all these things. And so how you manage those, how you purchase those, how you decide what you're going to make available, and so on, it gets quite complicated. And then there's also the things that are specific to particular libraries. So government documents, reports, local history, materials, maps, kits, puppets, and so on. So tons and tons of things to be considering and to be aware of. And depending on your role and the size and scope of your library, it can be quite overwhelming when you think about all the things that are out there. I think it's important to also think about the the sort of the draw toward technology. And so we want to be sure to always be thinking about, are we just getting caught up in the latest and greatest technology, or are we using our collection development policy, if you have one, or the mission of the library to guide our choices? Because maybe the electronic, maybe the newfangled thing that looks really hot and trendy isn't actually going to serve our users most effectively. So these are all kinds of questions that will arise, and I'm going to talk more about electronic resources and how you make these kinds of decisions and all the questions that are out there. That's going to be the focus of the third webinar in this series. So we will go more into those kinds of issues, things that are some of the issues around ebooks, which is very complicated and very, very difficult to sift through all of that. We'll talk about licensing and things like that. We'll touch on those things in that third session. So I'm going to table those kinds of things for now and focus more on the more general things. I think it's important, perhaps at this point, just to think maybe more sort of conceptually. So if you think about the fact that the difference between a printed book and an ebook, for instance, is that a printed book is really a container in a certain sense. And the libraries own them and circulate them and so on. Whereas ebooks are more like intellectual property, and they have different restrictions than the physical book. And so what ends up happening is there's questions of you can't lend it to your friend. If you take out an ebook, you're not going to be able to give that to your friend, or you won't be able to donate it when you're finished, or something like that. And of course, issues of licensing will always arise, and they're quite expensive. And so a lot of the concern about ebooks has to do with the expense of collecting those things. And also the sort of the dominance in the market, particularly of overdrive. Apparently, something well over 90% of public libraries that offer ebooks use overdrive. And so there's something about, is this good for the market, and what does this mean in terms of our freedom to choose and so on. So anyway, again, we'll touch on that more, but that's just a bit of a glimpse of some of those issues. Okay, so moving on here. Okay, and of course, so we'll have the genres and types. So we're still talking kind of about the resource landscape here. So we deal with reference materials, we deal with subject and discipline-specific materials, rare books, and then fiction and literature, of course, popular, romance, mystery, poetry, and so on. All these things they require a different kind of expertise, each of these areas. So there's so many choices available in reference and in any given discipline, so that it becomes quite difficult to sort of sort through everything that's available and possible choices for selection. And so when we talk about collection development, we're talking about the activities that relate to the development of library collections, including selection, determination and coordination of selection policy, assessment of the needs of users and potential users, budget management, identification of collection needs, outreach and liaison, planning for resource sharing, and contracts, review, and negotiation. So this is huge. So the job of a collection development librarian is big. There's a lot of responsibilities involved in this. Again, today we're really talking primarily about selection. Next week we'll talk about budget and collection development policy, and I'm going to refer here and there to the importance of a collection development policy, and I think perhaps it's already becoming clear why that's necessary in order to guide your decisions about selection. But again, if we pull this definition out, we can see some key words again, all the things that are involved here. So not just selection, but also assessment of the needs of users and potential users, identification of collection needs, and so on. So there's all kinds of things that go into this job. And I want to say a word about the importance of selecting and sort of give you a sense of, or talk about sort of a sense of the power that's actually involved when you think about what it is you're doing when you're making decisions about what your patrons will find when they search the catalog or browse, right? Because you're really making choices about what will be available and what will be harder for people to get their hands on if they're going to have to resort to ILO or purchasing books themselves. And I'm thinking, of course, with everything that's going on with what happened in your own state not very long ago, and now with Ferguson, thinking about, let's say you are looking at review sources and you're trying to find books about police violence, for instance, but you don't have enough money to really, you can't buy them all. But maybe you've spotted 5 books on police violence, and you really can only afford 1 or 2. How do you decide which message or what information, what kind of knowledge your patrons are going to encounter and use and take up and take out into the world, right? And so, of course, these kinds of decisions will depend on the size and scope and mission of your library. So I'm thinking about the small town public library. You'll have very limited funds, and you're going to have to spread that money across all kinds of topics that are likely to be of interest to a huge array of community members from all kinds of different backgrounds. And then all the formats that they're going to want as well, right? So a small town public library might want to make videos and video games and audio and ebooks available, but they have to stretch a finite amount of money. And so that librarian is going to really have to focus on what's popular, what's likely to be used by the most people. And in contrast, if your library is subject specific, perhaps you work in an academic library, you're a biology library or something like that, subject expertise is going to be essential. And you're going to have to do a lot of work to really figure out what are the best books in this particular field, because again, you're going to have limited funds. All libraries are facing tight budgets. And so how do you make these decisions about what your patrons are going to have access to? And so just things to think about, I think, just to have in mind when you are making these kinds of decisions. So the selection process involves, from that Johnson book, she identifies 4 stages of the selection process: the identification of the relevant, an evaluation of whether or not the item in question is worthy of selection, and then assessment whether or not that item is appropriate for your collection, deciding to purchase that item, and then ordering and acquiring the item. And so, first of all, what does this mean exactly, the identification of the relevant? And it means really going to sources like book reviews and finding an array of things that would be relevant to your users in your community. And of course, you're going to have to be sure to account for the broad spectrum of users in your community. So this, you might have to think about things like race and ethnicity, age, income level, immediate needs like job training information, or recreational wants like novels and movies. It's really going to depend on your community. What librarians will frequently do is, if they get a printed review source, something like Library Journal or something that has reviews, they'll page through and circle everything that looks interesting, and then they'll sort of narrow it down. And so I would say that the thing to do is try to, go to as many sources as possible as far as time allows. And kind of gather a sense of everything that's out there, and then narrow the choices based on all these things that matter in terms of your library. Things about the budget and so on, and you'd want to think about your existing collection's gaps, what your collection needs, how these materials might complement what you already have. Perhaps you have something from one perspective on a particular issue, now you need to bring in another perspective, something like that. And something that is really a good idea to do when you're selecting and you're doing that sort of sweeping, trying to figure out what's out there, you can keep a file, an Excel file or a Word document, and just kind of keep track of those things of interest. And you can create categories that are important to you, whether it's a grade level or something like that. And keep that around, because you never know, perhaps you get a grant where you can make more purchases than you can at any given moment. So in general, it's good to have a list that's longer than what your funding will support, and then narrow it. Okay. Volume. Is that question for me, Lily? Raise the volume on my speakers?
Yes, Dr. Adler, one participant says that she cannot hear you, or at least that's the way that I'm taking it, but I know you're under problems. So if you can raise your voice, that'd be great. Everybody else, prepare to lower your speakers.
Okay.
But if you cannot, if you can't, we understand you're having issues.
Yeah, I think that, yeah. I'll try to talk a little louder, but I'm not sure if it's going to help. Okay. You're good? Okay. Sorry. Is anybody else having a hard time? Do I need to be louder? Or are we okay?
I can hear you loud and clear, Doctor.
Okay. All right. Okay, so we are moving on. All right, so again, I'm going to reiterate this, and of course, we're talking about this next week, the collection development policy. And really, it is important. So a collection development policy, just briefly, will sort of account for your users, the mission of your library, and these kinds of things. But it will outline how you make these kinds of decisions that we're talking about. But if you don't have a collection development policy, it's still good to just have in mind what you kind of perceive your users to be, and be thinking about an imaginary policy. So that's kind of why I keep mentioning that. But I think that if you don't have a policy and you have to step into the job today and you're asked to make choices, today's webinar is going to help you. You can just step in and say, okay, we're going to do this, and this is how we're going to make these choices. Okay. So selection tools and resources, and this is going to be sort of the most practical aspect of this webinar, I think. And so when we're thinking about all the things that are out there that help us select, review sources, of course, are probably the most widely used, but they come in all kinds of different formats as well. And so, just like everything else with the information explosion, there are tons of selection tools and resources out there. And some of them might be found in what seem like relatively unlikely places. I'm thinking particularly of something like this. So, I found this one by Googling science book reviews. And I happen to read The Guardian quite frequently, so perhaps that's why Google put this at the top of my search list. But this is actually a really great source. So the Guardian offers, the Science Book Club, and there's great book reviews there. So you might find that you find reviews in all kinds of different places. But the more typical traditional sources are things like the New York Times Book Review, the Library Journal, Booklist, Choice, Publishers Weekly, and so on. And these are always, good, reliable sources. But of course, I think as we all know, and as I kind of keep hinting at, we really want to make sure that we're accounting for all the members of our community. So sometimes, if we have a particular kind of community or members of our community, or a specific subject interest among our user community, we're going to have to go to a more specific source. So something like the science reviews or something like that. That'll be more subject specific or audience specific. And I'm thinking of these two organizations that are associated with the American Library Association. So there's Reforma, which is an organization that is devoted to bringing services to Latinos and Spanish-speaking people. And they do have a section that's all about book reviews. And so that's a really great source for your Spanish-speaking communities. And then I'm also thinking of the GLBT roundtable of the ALA. And they also have on their website, as part of their newsletter, some really great review sources. And so in each of these, you have people that are librarians that are very interested in these particular communities or subjects or disciplines, working for other librarians to help you make these kinds of choices. So these are really good places to look. And if you go to the American Library Association website, you can find these different organizations and you can find their newsletters and so on. And again, in that list of resources that I'm going to supply, I'm going to provide some. Of course, it's not going to be an exhaustive list because there's so much out there, but I can kind of give you a feel for what's out there. Circus should be on the list. That's right. Absolutely. Of course. And so, yeah, there's tons and tons and tons of things out there. And then, of course, awards are always a really great place to look and to see what's out there. So you probably want to have some award winners, the Newbery Award winners, of course, but Pierre Belfray Award, the National Book Foundation. Again, there's tons of awards. And these can be national, book award kind of things, more general. But you could also have awards that are given out by societies and associations. And so, but it's always good to think about when you're looking for reviews or awards or anything else really out there, just like everything else. As librarians, we're always telling, we should always be thinking about evaluating our sources. I think that's one of the central tenets of our profession, being able to evaluate and choose. And so I'm thinking about something like, going to parenting books, for instance. Thinking about collecting, you need more parenting books. And so you look for, perhaps you Google parenting book reviews, and you find a lot. There's actually a lot out there and that kind of thing. So you have, the mommy bloggers with their book reviews, and then you'll have perhaps a more scientific organization. Maybe you'll have an organization of doctors, or maybe you'll have an organization that's a religious organization affiliated with a religious agenda or something like that. And so each of them might have a different perspective on parenting. And so it's important when you are looking at reviews to make sure you take into account the source, of course. Is it on a personal blog? Is it a professional site? Did librarians produce this, and so on? And then, of course, there's other resources as well. So some people actually like to just, maybe you go on Amazon and find out what's all there, because you can actually find reviews there. Sometimes they're not complete. So be a bit careful, be a bit, it's a little bit, I don't know. I don't always want to recommend going there. But there's certainly information to be had, and there's such a wide array of resources out there. And I also think about, Goodreads and some of the social networking sites. They offer information as well. And there you hear from users and readers what their opinions are. And the conversation, you can see the conversations that are being had about these things. And of course, there's bibliographies that are produced by associations and commercial organizations and so on. And then there can be book lists of various sorts, publisher announcements, catalogs, and so on. And then there's also tools by library type. So this, the core collection, this is an EBSCO product. You do have to pay for it, and perhaps some of your libraries do have this. But it helps you select, makes recommendations for, building a core collection. So it's kind of saying, okay, if you want to have graphic novels, these are the essentials, basically. And it has sort of 3 levels There's the highly, highly recommended, there's the core, and then there's the ones that you would add perhaps if your budget allows or you want to expand your collection a bit. Some people say be careful about these core collections because then what it results in is sort of a very narrow view of what's out there. So you want to maybe go beyond these, but they're out there and they're great selection tools. They're worth checking out. They do offer a free trial if you're interested, so you could do that as well. Okay. So let's say you've sort of surveyed the universe of materials that are available, that have been reviewed, and so on. You've kind of decided what you find to be of interest that might be relevant to your library and so on. And you've made some choices. Perhaps you've come up with a list of things that you potentially want to buy. And so the other thing that you need to do is evaluate the materials and maybe dig down a little deeper, go into these things and then see in themselves, are they quality materials? And then next you'll want to see if they are of value to the collection. So there's two different kinds of value that we're talking about. There's the evaluation of the content of the work itself, and then there's the evaluation or assessment of the value to the collection. So first thinking about the evaluation of the intellectual content of the material. So you'll be wanting to know, is this subject matter, is the content, is there quality to that, of course? Is it current? And of course, this is going to depend. Is this fiction or is it nonfiction and so on? Different questions will apply to different kinds of genres and disciplines and so on. But thinking about, all the different factors that go into an information product or something like that, a reading material. What's the reading level? Is it durable? Is the format going to last for a long time? What is the scope of the treatment? So perhaps I want a book on religion, and I want a very general book on Eastern religions or something like that. And so you want to maybe look at and see what the coverage is. Is it too focused on one particular, or is it too general, or something like that, right? And so the reputation or authoritativeness of the author, of course, is important. And then the cost in relation to the projected use and quality, and then quality of illustration. So all these kinds of things come into play. And of course, children's librarians I always find to be really amazing because they have this really special talent for being able to judge the quality of illustrations and quality of picture books and things like that in a way that now that I'm a parent, I'm better at doing that. But at the time that I've worked with children's librarians, I couldn't do that. So of course, you're going to come in with your own lens and your own expertise when you're judging the quality of an information resource or whatever it is that, however you like to call that. And then you have to evaluate the format, of course. So the durability, sustainability of the format, is this something that's going to change? So this is, with audio CDs, for instance, is this something that we want to keep purchasing, or should we be thinking about getting something that can be downloaded to individual players? Is the format going to change over time? Is this going to be obsolete? Is it going to be, 2 years down the road, we're not going to be able to use it anymore? Do you actually have equipment for hearing or viewing or reading the materials? Will you be able to circulate such equipment? Are people likely to have that equipment themselves? You'll want to think about the technical quality of the material, the aesthetics, the ease of use, because if it's not easy to use, people probably are not going to use it. And then perhaps some safety concerns, depending on what it is. There might be some safety issues. And of course, so there's always going to be a number of issues to consider when you're making these format decisions. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, you don't want to get swept away necessarily with the latest and greatest in technology. You have to be careful to sort of evaluate whether or not your money is best spent on getting the latest technology and what all is involved with that, with adopting a new format. And you want to also be thinking about the demand from your community, which is not always easy to ascertain. And really, one of the hardest things for libraries to study is the needs of their non-users. And so I'm thinking, for instance, of, maybe your actual library users are mostly older people, for instance, who do not necessarily want the latest technology, but they might, perhaps you have a very large collection of large print books to serve an older population. But you might actually not realize that you'll draw in a younger user community if you have more books and music and movies that they can perhaps download anytime that they want. So it's all kinds of factors have to sort of go into that decision. And so hopefully, surveying your community and really getting to know your community and what they need will help drive those decisions about whether or not you need to adopt the newer technologies. Are they demanding ebooks? Do they really want these things? Or is it just that people are talking about them a lot, but they really still kind of prefer the printed book? Because costs are going to be extremely important, especially with the electronic materials. There's going to be equipment upgrades and staff training and vendor licensing and all kinds of things that come into play with these kinds of decisions about format. I'm thinking, in particular, this is an anecdote, but I'm thinking about my kids' school. They put in smart boards in every room and got rid of the textbooks. Not one for the other, but that ended up being how the budget money was allocated. So the classrooms had the smart boards, and then they realized the bulbs on the projectors were going out really quickly, and that they were hundreds of dollars to replace. And so there was so much money spent on these smart boards and the maintenance, the long-term maintenance. And then they ran out of, then they chose not, I shouldn't say they ran out of money, that's not right, but then they chose not to keep buying textbooks. So it's that kind of thing that makes me scratch my head as a parent. And so in your library community, of course, those kinds of things could happen as well. So, of course, thinking about assessment, the value of an item to a collection, your user needs, who will use it, thinking about your existing collection. So the item in question, does it overlap? Does it provide a better or different or more balanced perspective? Or does it bring balance to what you already have? Does it support a curriculum that your library is also in support of? Does it meet faculty research interests or community interests? These kinds of things. When you're trying to think about the value of an item to a collection. And then, of course, the logistical matters, which I've kind of alluded to a little bit, but thinking about, can the library actually appropriately handle the item? So once we get it, will we be able to use it and deliver it to our patrons? Do we have the cataloging staff? Do we have the hardware to use it? Do we have an adequate shelving space or housing space? Do we have the support staff and the vendor support if it is something that is something that maybe our users are not likely to know enough about, right? And then also consortial obligations. Sometimes these kinds of things come into play and limit and constrain what we can do in terms of making these decisions. And then you may have heard of patron-driven or demand-driven, user-driven acquisitions, books on demand. But what this comes down to is who should be the selector, the librarian or the users? And this is something you may want to, if you're not aware of the patron-driven acquisition, you might want to, there are some articles out there, I'll put these on the list as well. But the idea is that it's mainly, well, almost entirely has to do with electronic resources, electronic books in particular, where your library might load bibliographic information into the catalog with a link to the content. And then after a certain number of views or perhaps a certain amount of time spent in that information resource, in that electronic book, then the library purchases the item automatically. And so this is something that's set up with the vendor, with EBSCO or something like that, and so that it becomes automatic. And if a book is clicked on a certain number of times, then a purchase goes through automatically. So that's something that's really sort of taking our world by storm to a certain extent. And so if you're not aware of that, I will definitely put some articles on the list, because it's worth understanding sort of the ins and outs of patron-driven acquisitions. And there's some controversial issues and some kind of some questions that revolve around this. So it's again fairly complicated. And if there's more interest, you can let me know, and I can try to fit that into one of the next sessions. Right now I don't have that penciled in as a main feature of those, but if you want me to, I can try to give that more attention than I have slated. So anyway, so now this brings us to the question of ethics and censorship and intellectual freedom. I've mostly just drawn from what's already out there with what the ALA has put out in terms of their own statements about the freedom to read, code of ethics, and so on. And so you can easily find this information. And here with the ALA Code of Ethics, I've just pulled out the ones that I think are of interest to us when we're talking about collection development, right? And so key among these is the idea that we have equitable service policies, equitable access, and accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses to all requests. That we resist all efforts to censor library materials, upholding principles of intellectual freedom, and so on. The fourth bullet, we do not advance private interests at the expense of library users, colleagues, or employing institutions. And we distinguish between our personal convictions and professional duties, and do not allow our personal beliefs to interfere with fair representation. And so these are some of the tenets that really, that need to be sort of always on your mind when you're making collection decisions, and really librarianship overall. But it's particularly important with collection development because I think it's very easy to not even realize that you're letting your personal convictions interfere with your ability to provide as balanced collection as possible. And so I just want to kind of cover a little bit of some of the, so top 5 banned books, for instance. And Banned Books Week is coming up next month, so something to be thinking about. But these are the kinds of things that are challenged or banned. Last year, these were the ones that were the most banned, the top 5. And so again, the freedom to read statement. And here, I'm not going to go through it because I think we're starting to, I want to have time for questions. But this is something that you should definitely read through so that if you do encounter a challenge, or if you do find yourself asking yourself, should I purchase this? It's likely to meet up with a challenge, or if people are going to be upset by this, they're not going to like this. Remember this kind of philosophy, thinking about, am I choosing not to purchase this because I'm afraid that it's going to be challenged or it's going to upset people? Or should I make sure that I'm honoring this philosophy of the freedom to read and intellectual freedom? And then there's some propositions that go along with this as well, that it's in the public interest to make available the widest diversity of views and expressions, including those that are unorthodox, unpopular, or considered dangerous by the majority. And again, I'm not going to read through these all because these are freely available, but if we make sure that that kind of thinking grounds our choices, I think we'll be okay for the most part. And it's these kinds of things that you can rely on if something is in fact challenged. And Lester Asham, he wrote a piece that became quite famous back in 1953, and I think it's really, it's still applicable. It's still referred to all the time. But I think it really gets at the central issue. The selector says, if there is anything good in this book, let us try to keep it. The censor says, if there is anything bad in this book, let us reject it. And since there is seldom a flawless work in any form, the censor's approach can destroy much that is worth saving. Right? So we should try to be thinking in a positive sense in thinking about selection. So selecting is sort of an active, positive way of approaching it and looking for the qualities in the books. And then I just have a couple of slides on bias, because of course we do all have our own personal biases. I have some issues with the idea of library neutrality, because I don't think it's possible for us to be neutral. And of course there's also a difference between thinking about a balanced collection and a diverse collection, because the idea that you can have a perfectly balanced collection I think is misleading. You can try to have as many perspectives as possible and have a diverse representation of what's out there, but I'm not sure that balance is ever necessarily possible, or even necessarily, I think balance kind of implies that everything is kind of given equal weight, and I don't know that that's ever possible, or not. I don't even know if it's necessarily desirable, but you do want to have a diverse array of perspectives on what's out there. And so collection development bias has to do with partiality in the selection of materials, some of the things we're already talking about, of course. And the idea of pre-censorship has to do with the restriction of materials from a collection during the selection process by a librarian who is authorized to select based on a conscious or unconscious bias. So again, this is getting at this idea that we do have our own personal biases. You may or may not be aware of what yours are, and so you want to try to be thinking about how you do bring in as many perspectives as possible. And then the censorship is more of the more active sort of prohibition of something. So it's less subtle than the pre-censorship. The pre-censorship, you might not know that you're doing it while you're doing it. Censorship is more of we are actually saying no to something in a sort of active sense. Okay, so just to wrap up, again, the key is to have a diverse collection in a changing environment with so many resources and formats. It's really great to have a team, and I think more and more libraries are going this route, trying to get as many people to contribute to the collection development and selection process to sort of guarantee that you do have more of a diverse range of perspectives involved in selection. Of course, we want to know where to turn for tools and assistance. There are some really great listservs and websites. Go to conferences and ask people what they are doing and so on. Go to sessions about this kind of thing, and you'll kind of get a feel for what people are facing and how they are actually coming to terms with these kinds of issues. And again, you'll have hopefully a collection development policy. And if you don't, come to the next session next week, and we will talk about how you do that, how you assess your community and your community's needs and your own budget and your own existing collection, and then arrive at a collection development policy that you can use. And this just kind of outlines what we're talking about next. And so with that, I'll take questions. Looks like we have about 7 minutes, and I do have plenty of battery power, so we're okay. Does anybody have any questions? Thanks, Lily. And again, even if you don't have questions, also if there's anything that you are particularly interested in learning about in the next 2 sessions that you want me to focus my attention on, You can put that in the chat box as well. I think there's also going to be a survey, an evaluation. You can do that there as well, but you can do that here, and I can write that down as I'm finalizing those slides and so on.
And while everyone is typing, and I'll be quiet if I see any questions there for you, Dr. Adler, I'd like to thank you for a wonderful webinar. We're very lucky to have you provide this learning opportunity and under duress without power. That's like awesome. Thanks. It is sometimes wonderful to have technology around us, like portable laptops. Great information. Attendees, a sneak peek of what is coming up. I'd like to remind you, even though it's up on the screen right now, that Dr. Adler will be presenting our next webinar in a series of 3 next Friday, August 29th. I believe it says the 28th slide, but it is the 29th, Labor Day weekend Eve. So what a great way to kick off your Labor Day weekend with an intermediate collection development, assessment, policy, and budgets. Registration is probably going to close this evening, but we're going to go ahead and open it up until Monday, and then you'll see my lovely seats are still available message that goes out to the listserv, and if anybody wants to attend and cannot register, I do invite you to contact us at the Swiflin office. We are more than happy to complete that registration for you. The last webinar in the series, as you do see on this slide, is going to be Friday, September 19th, and it's called Advanced Collection Development, Special Materials, and Resource Sharing. All of them are at Swiflin's usual webinar time, which is 10 a.m. Eastern. And registration is now open for that one and will continue to be open for the next week, and 2 and 3 until a week before. So please register early and register often. And be asked. Kay Oisted wants to know if Holocaust denial literature should be placed in a separate collection.
That's such a fantastic question. And so where that comes into play is you could look at this in a few different ways. One way would be that you could see this as, if you do place it in a separate collection, then that is an act of labeling, which the American Library Association generally opposes, because it's sort of, it means that you are making an assessment and doing sort of the judgment of the material for the readers. And there is a really, as part of the Intellectual Freedom Manual and on their website and so on, they do have a quite extensive statement on labeling and why they oppose that. And so you might want to turn to that and see what it says. And you might, I think there's not a yes or no answer to your question. It's going to depend on your library, it's going to depend on your community, and it's a difficult one. That's a really hard question. Because you could also argue that if you are of the position that that's sort of something like hate speech and that qualifies as that, then you might want to put it in a special place. So it's tricky, and it's something that you'd have to have, I think you'd have to have extensive meetings about with your librarians and maybe your user communities. But I think if it is something that falls under, First Amendment freedom of speech and freedom to read kinds of materials, technically I think we would say that if you put it in a separate place, that is in fact an act of labeling, which the ALA would not approve of. Does that help? Does that answer the question? Sort of. I would turn to the statement on labeling.
John S. has a question, and he wants to know if you'll be getting if the attendees will be getting a copy of the PowerPoint. Geez, I can't talk right now. And the answer to that is yes, John. We will be providing you with a PDF copy of the PowerPoint presentation when we send you the link and your survey. So be on the lookout for that. If anyone has requested a certificate, you'll also be receiving that as well. I also see another question from John. How do we register for the other 2 webinars? And that's a great question, John. Thank you for asking. You can go to the Swiflin website, which is www, and I'm putting it in the chat box, swiflin.org. And to the right-hand side of the page, you'll see a pretty little calendar with the Swiflin logo. If you click on that, it will take you directly to our calendar all months. So right now we're in the month of August. It'll take you directly to August of 14th. If you look for the 29th, you'll see that link there. And you can just click and register like you did for this one. And then if you click to the next month and you look for September 19th, you'll see that session already advertised, and you can click on that one and also register yourself for that. It's an awesome question. Thank you for asking, and thank you for registering. Yes, Shirley, everyone will receive a certificate.
I also saw another. Sorry.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
There was another question that I think has gone out of view now, and it was about what do you do when, how do you build a diverse collection? I can't see the question anymore, but
what do we do to gather a diverse viewpoint when selection tools for high-quality reviews may not always provide all viewpoints?
And that is another fantastic question. And I think that this is the kind of thing, I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I think, where one way that you can sort of deal with that kind of thing is maybe you go to a place where users are reading the book, something like Goodreads or Amazon, where people are actually providing their own feedback and their own experience of a text, but it's going to, of course, depend on what kind of material you're talking about. And you also, I think something you might know, if there was, I think I'm not, I mean, it might require some homework in terms of finding organizations that would be interested in a particular area of study or a particular topic, and seeing if they know where to turn. The question's a bit broad, so if you have a more specific sort of topic or something that you're thinking of, we might be able to narrow the question down, but it is a bit tricky, because I think that is one of the drawbacks. But what that is, also one of the great things about the web is that we are not any longer confined to a few resources or a few publications that do reviews. There's quite a lot out there. So I'm not sure if that helps a whole lot, but maybe other people have ideas as well.
Oh, Nancy, we will be adjusting the registration closing for the one on the 29th within the next 5 to 10 minutes, so please try back this afternoon, and you'll be able to register yourself for the afternoon. We do close registration 1 week ahead of time so we can start putting our ducks in a row, but we will reopen the 29th until Monday, and we'll do that at the end of this webinar, and we'll leave it open until Monday, and then we'll be sending out a message to the listserv as well. Martha Brumfield, sorry that you missed the beginning of this webinar, but we will be sending you a link along with your PowerPoint. You can catch up in time for you to attend next week's webinar. I think that's all of the questions that I see in the chat box. For those of you that haven't liked us yet on Facebook, please remember to do so, because the minute that we put something up as a new item, once you open up your Facebook and you see your news feed and you filter through all of those those ALS Ice Bucket Challenges this week, you'll find an event announcement from Swiftland that we've put up a new workshop or webinar for you. If you're also on Twitter, you can find us on Twitter, and we also advertise new workshops and webinars via that method too. Well, you can look for your friendly message from me on the listserv. I'm always looking for ways to reach out and touch you. I realize I'm obnoxious, and it's only because I'm very passionate about you guys getting the training that you need and that you deserve. So if you have any more questions, I'll be staying on for a few minutes. Other than that, I think we have concluded this week's webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Adler, for overcoming adversity. And everybody have a terrific weekend. Hope it's not rainy unless you like rain.
Thanks so much. It was fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed listening to it.